Hey, what's up? This is Jake. You're in Jake's shop. So I'm back on the 68 Camaro. Did some work with my buddy 69 there, and back on the 68. I should be probably cutting and buffing the clear coat at this point. You know, I've done some of that, but a lot of our projects with anything, it's about what is interesting right now. And since this is just a hobby for me, right now, I want to get this intake bolted in. Really, on this particular video, I'm just going to go over setting up the intake and bolting it into the car. I'm not going to get into fuel injection and a bunch of LS garb. If you guys are interested, I might do a video on it. Go ahead and comment in the comments there and let me know if you want to do an LS swap video. The first LS swap I actually did was about 15 years ago, before all this really cool tech was out there. Now, this is some technology. I went ahead and ordered this kit about 6 months ago, maybe longer. It's been sitting in a box. I want to get rid of the box. So I'm not going to bother with unboxing videos or anything like that. I'm going to try out an LS1 fuel injection kit from Fitech. Now, Fitech is actually a pretty cool company. They have a lot of really cool technology that they're doing with automatic, self-learning tuning systems and you name it. Now, this particular LS1 I bought when I bought the Camaro, or when I bought the LS1 for the Camaro, it did not come with an intake. What that basically means is a $500 bill up to $1,000, depending on what types of intakes you want. I probably could have found a junkyard special, something that would have worked for 150, 200, whatever bucks. I kind of wanted to go with a different look. That's why I went ahead and got this kit. This particular kit is from Fitech. This is the ultimate LS kit that I'm going to be trying out in this car. This is the first time I've ever tried out Fitech. I've seen some good things, some bad things about them, so we're going to try this out. Worst case scenario, we'll be able to use pretty much every component in this kit, even if I decide not to use their computer. But I think I can use it, and I think it's going to be great. We won't know that for many, many months from now when I finally get to firing off this car. But for the first point, we're just going to go ahead and do the intake. There's actually some pretty good directions that came in this kit, and it comes with, it looks like most everything. But we'll go into the video, I'll show you exactly what it takes to bolt this thing together and bolt it into the engine for step one of this process. Okay, first thing I noticed when opening the box, I bought this kit about 6 months ago, maybe longer than that now, I don't even know. This is a 7002 kit. What this kit basically is their 92 millimeter throttle body, so it's gonna be good for over 500 horse, no problem. It came with everything. It came with a wiring harness, computer, a whole new engine harness, all the fuel injectors, and all of the sensors. What it doesn't come with, from what I can tell, are maybe some plugs and a few things here and there. I won't really know until I fully install this kit, but most of what I can see right now, it's all there. One major problem I had when I first bought this kit is a couple things. When you open that box up, you're gonna see this intake, and there is gonna be stuff inside this intake, at least mine was. There was a bunch of stuff inside here as far as packaging and actually components for the kit to install it. So make sure, always inspect your parts. The other thing I realized, when I looked inside the original intake I received in this kit, it actually had a repair joint where they did on top of here, on the intake. It must have been a bad weld or maybe bad when they actually molded it, and it looked like someone had repaired it. You can see a little scuff on it. Now, this is a very visible piece on the car. It's like artwork. The intake itself is beautiful, the ticks look great. But on the other intake I had, it was scuffed up. So I went ahead and sent it back and got a new one. It only took about 4 months to get. The kit itself took 3 months to get. So I'm hopeful that by the time this video actually shows up on the internet, people have a better luck with getting parts. Price is right. Price is great. I mean, by the time on my other LS conversion, by the time I modified harnesses and dealt with computers and paid someone to tune it and did all of that junk, the kit was worth it for me, especially since I needed an intake. So we'll get on the next step with starting to bolt this thing together. Okay, so first thing I noticed is when you pull out the directions, they're pretty well done. They're actually in color. They're fairly easy to understand. There's a few things that they don't actually tell you. The first step in the process is pretty straightforward. You install the throttle body. Now the throttle body, they actually in the kit provide you with a bunch of nice little O-rings here. This O-ring is not, it's a little bowed up and whatnot, but it looks good. It's a fine piece. In here, it doesn't really say to put anything on it, but as a rule of thumb, I like to put a little lithium grease on these. And what this does is it goes right on the face of the throttle body here, or of the intake, so you can bolt the throttle body on. The throttle body overall looks like a very nice piece. I even like the touch of orange inside there. It's not going to do anything for any other purposes. And it just says to clean the back where it mates up. Now there is a kit they offer, which a lot of times probably recommend actually buying. I haven't yet, I may. And what that is it's a cable, throttle cable bracket, part number 67001, that bolts in between these two pieces to give you your throttle bracket so you can attach your cable throttle to it. I may decide to do that. I may make my own bracketry. I really don't know what I want to do there. All I'm trying to do is get this thing together and get it in the car for now. I can always easily take this throttle body on and off. Now, one thing about the throttle body is it needs a couple sensors. Now, and it's kind of interesting because I noticed this box was brand new. Everything was completely sealed, wrapped up tight. It talks about there's actually two main sensors on these throttle bodies. You've got your throttle position sensor, and you've got your air intake temperature sensor, or excuse me, your idle air control sensor, sorry, bolted, that needs to bolt on the side of this. So they provided those sensors. This one happened to already be bolted in. I want to check I'll definitely check the tension on those. And then here's your throttle position sensor. Sorry, idle air control sensor. I kind of like this idle air control sensor because it's black. You know, for me, a lot of things are about visual on this car, especially since it's so visual when you open up the car what this thing looks like. I like that it's black. A lot of them are actually silver. So all you do is remove those two Allen bolts. I'm going to put a little bit of white lithium grease on that O-ring, and then I'll bolt that in. So we'll get that set up and bolted together, and we'll do the next step. Okay, so I went ahead and bolted that sensor on. It's actually, I really like the Allens this thing comes with. They look like they're a stainless steel style Allen. They're a really nice piece. Same with the Allens that bolt the throttle body into position. They're a really nice piece. Now, a lot of people like to geek out on torque specifications for everything. It's kind of interesting because even in the manual, they actually do not say anything about torque specifications in here, which on something like this is like, who cares? You know, when you're assembling an engine, or you're bolting a water pump on, or you're bolting the intake onto the engine, you'll want to do a torque sequence and a torque specifications for something like that because there's so many bolts, and you want to make sure those gaskets seal right. But when you're bolting on a throttle body, it's just a standard O-ring. The only thing I like to do, rule of thumb, is snug it up, and since there's 4 bolts on this particular throttle body, just cross them, just like you're bolting on a wheel of a car, right? Put one lug in, put another lug in on the opposite side, and then transition it and move those back slowly, you know, back forth in kind of a star pattern, and move it around so it seats evenly. Other than that, just make sure they're snug. If you can get a ton of torque with an Allen wrench, then enough to strip it, then you've got a problem, and it doesn't need that. It's aluminum. You know, you definitely don't need to go heefing on these things, perking on these things. The other thing it doesn't say anything about is what this little part is. Now, what this is I believe what it hooks up to is the intake vent. It's just a vacuum vent, and it goes off the top of the throttle body. You can probably use it or not. My guess is it's a 10 millimeter because everything seems to be metric nowadays. Of course, it's 10. And it's a pipe thread. I'm not going to bother putting anything on them. It's just a vacuum line. You just want to make sure it's sealed. You know, you don't want vacuum leaks, especially in a fuel injected system. You know, a teeny vacuum leak in a carbureted system you may not realize or notice, but a small leak in a fuel injection system can bring a lot. Now, you definitely don't want to torque that thing down crazy either. Just make sure it's nice and snug and it won't go anywhere. So, the other thing I always like to do when I'm bolting on throttle bodies is just make sure you've got clearance, you got nice movement there. There's no issues with the casting itself and the throttle body or the intakes. You know, make sure you've got nice fluid movement there, and it feels great. So that's great. So next thing in the kit, it says installing the fuel rails. They provide the fuel rails for you. They've got all of the premium flow matched injectors, which, by the way, on my Firebird, I bought custom flow matched injectors, which are a little higher volume. I don't know the total off the top of my head, but those things ran more money than this entire kit did. So injectors are expensive. That's another reason why I decided to do this intake, was because of this. Buying new injectors. You know, old injectors work, but you still would need to get them cleaned or find a company who can actually clean them properly for you. Sometimes they'll clean up and they'll work fine, and sometimes they won't. All right, so now onto the fuel rails. Let's see what these things actually look like, because I have no clue. The other weird thing in this kit I noticed is it talks about putting silicone on the O-rings of the fuel injectors when you install them. Now, silicone is a sealant. I don't like silicone. I'm just not a big fan of silicone. It's one of those things where I'm not going to do it. I might regret that later. I don't know. Never done it before with silicone. My other fuel rails work great without silicone. These are nice. Nice billet aluminum. Of course, they got their name all over them, but that's a nice looking fuel rail. And it's kind of permanent. Once you put silicone on something, if you try and take that out of there, it's going to be a nightmare to try and clean it up if it actually dries. I'm not going to put silicone on. I'm going to go ahead and use white lithium grease. I use white lithium grease a lot. Kind of keep things lubed up, actually helps provide a seal, keeps, you know, gaskets and rubber type O-rings and whatnot from getting dry and cracked up, and kind of keeps them nice and supple. Okay, so we're gonna, first steps first, I want to take those out and take a peek at them, see what they look like on the fuel rails. First steps first in those, we actually install the injectors themselves. Like I said, I'm gonna only be using some white lithium grease to seat those. Worst case scenario, I regret that later. But if you can't bolt down the fuel rail tight enough to get that thing to seal, it actually requires silicone, I would think there's a problem. All right, so these are your injectors. Nice little O-rings on both sides. Kind of look at them, inspect them. Make sure not to tear these O-rings. These things are actually pretty key in the process. So it talks about seating these injectors down. Now obviously there's two sides to this injector. You've got where the injector goes in and obviously where the fuel comes in this way. So the injector is going to sit up at an angle like this so you can connect your fuel rails. Your fuel rails will bolt on and kind of sandwich those into the actual intake. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go ahead and do these. I'm not going to bother videoing the entire process, but just a really light layer of lithium grease on these is what I'm going to do. Make sure not to get any down in those injectors, in those little holes. They are micron holes, and they are very, very hard to clean. So just kind of lightly push that down in place, make sure it's nice and seated. And you're going to do that for the whole entire system. If you want to use what the directions recommend, don't use a lot of it. If you want to use silicone, just don't use a ton of it. You don't want it to get in here and clog anything up, and you definitely don't want to get it on either the intake side either. White lithium grease should work. That feels like a really nice fit, and as long as those gaskets stay nice and supple and don't dry out, you're going to be golden, at least in my expectations. Okay, so probably one of the hardest things to do is get this fuel rail on. So here we go. So I like to kind of put it on one and the other. Now, when you put the injectors in on this intake, make sure they're fully seated and fully down. Now, what I'm going to do is line them up and just kind of wiggle it. If it's warm in here, those are going to be expanded, and just kind of rock it back and forth until you get your seat, and then slowly push it on. The last thing you want to do is rip one of those O-rings. If you do, you're going to have to replace it. So okay, that is nice and snug. So after that, all you're going to really do is attach these fancy little brackets to the assembly. It's nice and snug. So I'm going to just go ahead and bolt these bolts down. I might use just a tad bit. It doesn't actually say it in here, but I'm probably going to use just a little bit of thread locker. What thread locker does for me is it kind of adds an additional layer of corrosion resistance. So what happens with dissimilar metals like aluminum and steel, when they're touching each other for a long amount of time, especially with weather, if it was, you know, in the elements for a long amount, you're going to get corrosion on the aluminum. It actually has some sort of chemical reaction. You could probably Google and figure out what it actually is, but it happens. So what I like to do is, if I put a little bit of thread locker in there, yes, it's keeping the bolt in a little bit better for me, but moreover, what it's actually doing is helping me to keep corrosion at a minimum. That steel bolt or stainless steel bolt won't corrode inside that well as easy when you've got that light layer inside there. The other thing the directions do say about things, and actually I've heard actually helps, is put oil on the bolts. Just a little bit of dab of oil. Problem with oil is it's viscous, right? And there's a possibility of the bolt backing itself out. Now, on an intake, probably not. But those are other measures you can do to kind of resist the chemical reaction that can happen between steel and aluminum or different metals that will actually take place. So these little brackets are pretty nice. They actually provide you some pretty good nuts and bolts here. These are stainless steel Allens, so they'll be flush mount in the face of this after I get them installed. And then the brackets down below, they've got nice little stainless Allens that'll bolt those down inside there. So I'm gonna get my thread locker and bolt the rest of those up. I'm not going to bother showing that entire process. The other thing it does say to do that I skipped over is go ahead and install the intake temperature sensor. They provide one in the package. See, it's actually got a layer of some sort of thread locker on it. And again, that's going to be brass and aluminum connecting together. There's the port right there. And this thing I'm not bothered doing anything with other than snugging it down. Again, I'll grab a wrench and tighten it, but it's going to go right there. Now, the intake's still not ready to be bolted on because after inspection, you realize that there's still holes in the bottom of this thing. Now, those are vacuum lines as well. There's way more vacuum lines than I need on this particular car. If you were running a car that had a lot of other vacuum ports that were needed, you could use a bunch of them. So in the kit, it was kind of handy. They did provide you with a bunch of these little hose connectors to thread into there, which I'll use. I'll probably thread them in, and I'll use the big one for my power booster for my brakes, right? But the rest of them I'm just going to end up capping off, because on this particular car I don't need this many. So those need to be threaded in and capped properly. I'm going to cut this into the video, but I thought I'd go ahead and show what these look like closer up. There's a lot of vacuum ports under here, and I can only assume that's just, you know, to run a bunch of different applications. You know, an LS1 and can go into just about anything, and some vehicles might have a lot of the emissions on them and whatnot. But here's what I did. I actually got a rubber elbow that fit onto those barbed fittings for that bigger port for the vacuum line. Went ahead and ran it back and over. Well, I guess you were supposed to put the map sensor on first thing. The good news is they gave me a map sensor, which is kind of handy. If you had an existing LS1 and you're unbolting and bolting an intake, you could probably use your existing map sensor. But the map sensor is awesome, especially since this thing is basically converted to fuel density tuning, as far as I'm aware. It uses the map sensor to figure out that, as well as other things. So anyways, I go ahead and bolt that thing on as well, replace that little cap. Okay, final prepping stages for this intake. On the underside, I would go ahead and get the gaskets prepped and ready. And these are just a nice little rubber gasket. They fit right in here. And what I'm going to do, attempt to do, is add just a little bit of engine oil, whatever engine oil you have, add just and coat the gaskets and pre-insert them right into the intake ahead of time. And then when you flip it over, just be careful they don't move around. They kind of lock in here. So they should kind of wedge in there to where they'll actually stay. And if you're careful when you drop the intake down, they shouldn't fall out. Okay, so obviously the car's taken apart and we've got everything pretty much prepped and ready for the intake. I had all my intake runners actually covered with tape, so Caden here helped me and cleaned everything up. Intake's ready to go on for the most part. I actually went ahead and put a light layer of oil on the underside of the intake, and I'm gonna put a light layer of oil on here as well. It helps with corrosion. It also helps just make sure those gaskets kind of stay fluid and moist and seal up nice to the intake once it's all torqued down. The other thing, if you're actually changing an intake out on your LS and you've got, you know, a fresh motor here that you just took apart, definitely want to make sure every bit of it's actually, you know, really cleaned off. And what I like to do is I'll use a razor blade carefully not to scuff the nice machine surface there where the intake meets the heads, but I will also make sure that I come back through with maybe a little bit of thinner and a rag and then clean it so that's just perfectly clean. And that's what I did just now before I went and got this stuff ready. So got the intake up here. I'm trying not to scratch up my car. Luckily, like I said earlier, I've been taking a break and not wanting to buff it. So like I said, a light layer of oil across the entire face. Here's my vacuum port I actually went ahead and put on. It'll come up over here on the brake booster on the driver's side of the car. Go ahead and set this on as evenly as possible. You know, the other thing in this kit that I found interesting is none of the intake, or none of the bolts and nuts and none of the nuts and bolts and washers actually said where in the heck they go. So that's not very conducive or fun to figure out that side of it. So what I ended up doing actually was putting lock washers obviously on the intake bolts. The only thing on the intake bolts themselves are actually these nice little stainless steel Allens. They have a lock washer and a regular washer, and the only thing I'm going to do to these is put a light layer of coating of oil on them before I put them in. And there's also a torque sequence to be very mindful of when you go to bolt this thing down. It is in the directions here pretty plainly. You're working from the inside out and alternating sides, essentially. So hopefully that'll show up in the camera, but it's 1, 2, and then work your way around. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So you're working from the inside out and across in the same fashion. That way everything seats down correctly. Now there is a torque sequence. So what you would typically do is go to 44 inch-pounds on each bolt first, or Allen, and then come back through and you're supposed to do 89 foot-pounds, or excuse me, inch-pounds. Foot-pounds and inch-pounds are a huge difference, and most torque wrenches, 3H drive torque wrenches, don't go to inch-pounds. You have to go to a 3H drive ratchet. This is a really cheap one. I actually would like to get a digital one someday. A lot of the 3H digital ones will actually go down to inch-pounds or convertible for the nicer ones. This will work for me. I've done enough intakes on LSs that I know almost by feel what it is, but I'll double check myself with the actual torque wrench while I go to torque this intake down. So Overall, everything's lining up really nicely. I like how it's fitting. Everything looks really clean. That intake looks really cool in there, actually, doesn't it, Caden?
Yeah.
The other thing I did want to point out, I'm not going to bother going through the torque sequence and torquing this down on camera, but there's another thing that they don't, I haven't read it, maybe I haven't read it thoroughly enough, but what is this? You know, and if you're working on an engine, you have it apart for any given amount of time, make sure every intake hole, everything's plugged. That way stuff doesn't settle down in there, or you drop a nut or a bolt or something down inside there. This, what's that thing called again? Throttle body is actually sealed off for the most part, but everything else before now was open. That's why I had it taped off. Same with the fuel rails, especially the fuel rails. The little orifices inside these injectors are so small, and you just don't want anything getting inside there. So if it's going to sit like this open, I definitely want to plug off where my air fuel supply and return are going to be. I initially thought I wanted to run them off the back of the engine to keep the engine bay clean, but this is a bypass that comes in the kit. It's a very nice stainless steel piece with nice aluminum billet aluminum and fittings here, and it's basically to make the bypass happen between each side of the fuel rail. So I'm going to put it on the back, which actually fits perfectly right there. It won't rub on anything, and it'll actually fit rather nicely. The front was where my supply and return are going to come in, and everything will be run at the same pressure. I'll probably end up running a fuel regulator out here anyways and find a fancy way to mount it. They look really cool when they're installed in the engine properly. So I'm just going to snug those by hand for now, come back and tighten those up, but that's essentially the last part of the puzzle that you're going to want with this intake. But overall, I think it turned out really nice, and it actually looks really good. And it'll be sealed up. And just one more thing, it's kind of fun and exciting to do when you get to this point in your car and you're building. I'm tired of buffing on this car. I haven't really even started this. I've just done the trunk lid and the deck and the front hood. I'm probably going to leave the hood off for a while. I need to find a place to put it so I can put my Firebird in here. But hey, if you like this video at all, hit like and subscribe, and I'll keep doing updates on the car. Thank you.